This is a story of America's land, the public land that we all own, the national forests and national grasslands that we use and enjoy, and where we resolve our conflicting interests. Since 1905, the United States Forest Service has been at the forefront of this ongoing experiment in democracy on the ground. An experiment that asks a basic question: what is the greatest good? America became a world power on the strength of its natural resources. As the nation expanded from sea to sea, these resources seemed limitless. For European settlers, the greatest good meant clearing the land. Trees were an obstacle, but timber was prized. Before the age of petroleum, the nation's economy was built on wood. Horses drew wooden carriages over planked roads. The southern pines produced millions of barrels of tar and pitch for sealing wooden ships. Wood-fired engines pulled trains over millions of railroad ties that rotted and had to be replaced. As the forests of the Northeast, South, and Lake States fell to the axe, alarms sounded about an impending shortage of wood, a timber famine.
The idea of a timber famine was, at the time, understandable because people who looked into the eastern forest could see that all of the prime trees were being cut or were already gone.
And they were worried about running out because their experience had been cut over landscapes, abandoned and moving west, and they were running out of places to move west to.
Painters and writers, naturalists and philosophers idealized the American landscape. The vast wilderness distinguished this new world from Europe. They looked upon the march of progress with great ambivalence. In 1864, George Perkins Marsh wrote Man and Nature. In it, he compared the cut-over mountains of his native Vermont with the barren landscapes of the Mediterranean.
What Marsh did as a U.S. consul in Italy and also in Turkey was to recognize that the Mediterranean had been devastated. A land that once was heavily treed. We talk about the cedars of Lebanon. Where are they? They're gone.
And he said, it could probably happen to us if we don't protect our forest, if we don't protect our stream flow. We could become what the Mediterranean is. We could become just another desert.
In 1865, a year after the publication of Man and Nature, a boy was born whose love of the outdoors and influential parents would lead him to become America's first homegrown forester.
What Gifford will do is to repair the land that his grandfather and great-grandfather destroyed.
Gifford Pinchot's family immigrated from France and settled in Milford, Pennsylvania. There, they built a fortune by cutting down forests and selling the land to farmers.
The logging that the Pinchot family generated was cut and run. You took your axe, you ripped down the landscape, you ripped it all the way down because you were going to sell this for farming land, and then you just shipped it off to market.
By the 1880s, Gifford Pinchot's parents were among those who feared a timber famine. In Milford, they built a summer home, Gray Towers, and set out to restore the damaged landscape.
You see the change of the focus of the family from that of gaining and growing wealth to that of using their wealth to make an impact on American life. And I think James and Mary Pinchot dedicate the most valuable thing they have to it, their oldest son.
During his studies at Yale University, Gifford Pinchot's parents gave him a new edition of Man and Nature, now retitled The Earth as Modified by Human Action.
They gave the book to their son in his 21st year, and in effect, they're telling him, this is your career.
And their lives become completely focused on Gifford's success and his potency in bringing this forestry to life in the United States.
He went to his professors at Yale and said, I want to be a forester. What do I do? And they had no way to answer him because there was no forestry practiced in the United States. That if he really wanted to pursue this profession, he had to go to Europe.
In France and Germany, Pinchot learned how forests could be managed using the principle of sustained yield. Trees were a crop that could be harvested profitably forever.
In Europe, there was a very clear sense that the forest needed to be rigorously managed if, in fact, it was to be sustainably used. The forest would be controlled so as to maximize benefits, so as to increase the yield. All of those were dreams that European forestry handed over to Americans like Pinchot.
From very early on, Pinchot was a strong advocate of what we would call scientific forestry, but he thought it should be applied quite differently here in the United States.
Gifford Pinchot believed that American forestry should reflect the democratic values of the nation. America's land should be managed for the benefit of all. But the nation had no plan for managing its vast land holdings. The policy was to dispose of them.
The General Land Office of the United States Department of the Interior is just giving it all away as fast as possible.
Land grants to railroads opened the West to rapid development. Uncontrolled mining, ranching, and logging reshaped the Western landscape. Corrupt syndicates found ways to sidestep the law to bring public domain lands under their control.
You want land, and there are rules attached to it. But getting around the rules is the fun of it all. Fraud is the American way. You have to be above 21, but nobody says years of age, do they? So you paint a 21 on your shoe and you stand there in the land office and say, I'm above 21. And you are, you're above it. And you get the homestead, even though you're underage.
In 1891, Congress added a one-sentence amendment to a land law reform bill. These words would have far-reaching effects, becoming the basis of the federal system of public lands. The amendment gave the president the power to reserve forested lands for the public good.
The importance of the forest reserves of 1891, the act that created them and in time they would grow into national forests, is that it happened at all.
For the first 100 years of the American Republic, our attitude towards the public lands was to get rid of them to railroads, to land speculators, to homesteaders, to others.
That a nation would decide in 1891 that some lands will never be given away, that they will be held in the hands of the people, all people, not some people, but all people, is a tremendous shift.
This was a radical step that would be better for the nation as a whole to keep some lands in public ownership so they could be managed for the good of all the people and that we could prevent resource damage.
It's a remarkable step for a nation to make.
president may now, by proclamation, set aside lands on the public domain and say they're not open to occupancy, sale, or settlement. They're not for disposal. They are for the future. And this is a significant, dramatic departure from 100 years of American history.
By the time President Benjamin Harrison's term ended in 1893, he had designated 15 reserves. But the Forest Reserve Act said nothing about what should be done with these lands. Should they be protected, like Yellowstone National Park, for their aesthetic and recreational values, or open to use by local communities? Without a clear answer, and without consulting Western congressmen, President Grover Cleveland exercised his authority.
Cleveland was leaving office in 1897, and just before he left office, he doubled the size of the forest reserves from 19 to 39 million acres with a sweep of a pen. That caused a firestorm in the West.
Outraged members of Congress tried and failed to eliminate these reserves, while others, supporters of scientific forestry and watershed protection, pushed through a law outlining their purposes.
It's one thing to have the land set aside, it's another thing to know what you're going to do with it. And in effect, that opens the way for Gifford Pinchot to begin the process of forestry in the United States in a very sustained way that has now lasted us over a century.
In 1897, Gifford Pinchot was appointed Special Forest Agent by the Department of the Interior. Its powerful General Land Office controlled the forest reserves, but the scientific expertise was in the Agriculture Department. In 1898, Pinchot became Chief of Agriculture's tiny division of forestry, and he laid his plans to bring the forests and the foresters together.
We talk about Gifford Pinchot as our first scientifically trained American forester. What he really is our first political forester, and he was a genius at that. Keep in mind that his parents, this moment he had this new position in Washington, built a home for him, a beautiful house in which he could entertain hundreds of people at a pop, which meant this chief of a lowly bureau in the Department of Agriculture could have congressmen and senators to his home.
The Pinchot family endowed a forestry school at Yale. Its students completed their field program at Gray Towers.
So he creates the school, he creates the agency that will provide the labor for those students, he creates the journal that they will read, he creates the professional organization that they will join and pay dues for. In short, he gave birth not to the Forest Service, but to a profession, and there are very few single individuals about whom that can be said.
The assassination of President McKinley gave the new century a dramatic start.
After the death of McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt became president. You know, the Republicans had hoped by making him vice president, they'd never hear from him again. And here he was president. And he was a strong conservationist.
Roosevelt had long been interested in conservation issues. Nature was the world he loved most. And so when Roosevelt comes into office, it was as if God had sent manna. How many chiefs of agencies are very close friends with the President of the United States? And that helped Pinchot enormously. He spoke in his own name, to be sure, on the one hand, but everybody knew who stood behind him.
Although both men were born into wealth, they distrusted the business tycoons who were reaping enormous profits from the nation's natural resources.
Conservation was very well advanced by the time Teddy Roosevelt became president of the United States. But Teddy Roosevelt finalized it with a vengeance.
Roosevelt worked to get the forest reserves out of the General Land Office and under the supervision of Gifford Pinchot.
Gifford Pinchot hated the General Land Office. He hated it with a passion. He hated the Interior Department. He thought they were in bed with every scoundrel in the country. And in many respects, he was right.
Gifford Pinchot organized an American Forest Congress in January of 1905. It provided political backing for a law transferring the forest reserves to the Agriculture Department. The Bureau of Forestry became the United States Forest Service, and the forest reserves were soon renamed the National Forests.
The name change from the forest reserves of the late 19th century to the national forests of the 20th century is symbolically important for a couple of reasons. Reserve means withdraw. But Pinchot is actually really interested in the word national. It meant nationally owned, nationally controlled, nationally regulated, and that reinforced the notion of a forest service, and its mission was to serve the people of the United States.
It's founded in this very idealistic moment. It is, in the eyes certainly of its own staff, but in the eyes of the American populace as a whole, the perfect government bureaucracy. The purely idealistic government bureaucracy, the one that is really doing what government ought to do. The people who are recruited into it are immensely idealistic, and they really do think that they know best. And sometimes they get into trouble in a democratic context because of that.
The Forest Service sought men who were self-motivated, men who loved the outdoors and could learn on the job. Ehlers Koch was one of those men.
Ehlers Koch grew up in Montana in the Gallatin Valley. His parents were involved in ranching and farming. He had gotten wind of Yale starting a school in forestry.
For Koch and his classmates, Yale instilled the esprit de corps that Pinchot wanted for his new agency.
They are full of the spirit of this new movement, and they're going to be dispersing out all over the country. But for this time being, while they're studying under the foremost experts in the field of forestry, Gifford Pinchot knows all of them personally. They are a very special group of students.
For the first 25 years, more than 50% of the graduates of the Yale School go in to work for the Forest Service. In fact, the joke about the Forest Service is it's referred to as the Yale Club.
Hired by the Forest Service upon graduation, Ehlers Koch was assigned to Missoula, Montana.
The Lolo and the Missoula National Forest were virgin territory. And you can imagine what it must have felt like when he stepped off the train in Missoula, Montana with his young Danish bride at 27 years old to begin work. First of all, where is the National Forest? He has to determine boundaries, he has to set up an office, he has to do local hires, and he really goes at it.
When the national forests were created, they hadn't been surveyed, the boundaries weren't laid out. They didn't have any structure of governance there. There weren't ranger stations, there weren't roads. It was a tremendous job just to get these lands identified and under management and under some form of protection. And the term national forest itself was misleading because so much of the land wasn't timberland. Half of the national forests were grazing lands. Most of the mountain peaks of the U.S. are in national forests, and they're nothing but ice and rocks.
To help him manage 1 million acres of wild land, a supervisor like Ehlers Koch had a handful of rangers and forest guards.
Initially, all the district rangers were pretty much local hires. They picked people of what they called high moral character. They wanted people that were already respected and admired in the communities.
Respect in the West also meant the ability to handle tough characters in dangerous situations. It was said of one old-time ranger, he didn't start any fights, but he didn't lose any either.
There became a notion within American culture that the forester and the forest ranger was a symbol of the efficient new state, was a symbol of a society that was becoming civilized.
Whether you were a college-educated forester, or a locally hired forest guard, all Forest Service employees had to pass a civil service exam. The exam included such practical matters as packing a horse and cooking a meal in the field and then eating it.
Every forest officer was required to keep a daily log of what they were doing and what they were working on. And you can imagine these vary quite a bit. Some of them that you read, they go on for pages in their descriptions. Others is, I worked on grazing, period, that's it. 5 days later, continued to work on grazing. There's a funny entry in one of the diaries. I saw the forest supervisor 4 times this year. He saw me twice.
What we forget in this age in which we fight over timber all of the time is that it wasn't timber people fought over in the early part of the 20th century. It was always grazing, because that's where the West made most of its money.
One reason for that is that very little timber was being cut from national forest lands. The grazers were the established users and the controversial users, and the ones that gave the Forest Service fits.
The Forest Service on grazing was faced with the fact that there were cows and sheep all over the national forests. Now, they ranged freely without charge. Regulating became a major project.
Pinchot hired Arizona rancher Albert Potter to develop a system for controlling livestock on federal land. Despite low fees and minimal restrictions, the policy met bitter opposition. The grazers claimed that access to the public lands was a right, not a privilege.
It was not certain that the Forest Service had the authority to regulate use on the national forest or even to sell timber.
Colorado rancher Fred Light deliberately violated his grazing allotment. Supported by his state legislature, he challenged Forest Service authority in court. This became one of several test cases tried by Forest Service attorney George Woodruff.
He takes 11 cases to the Supreme Court. He wins all 11, 10 of them unanimously. The congressional delegations from the West are livid. They feel that Pinchot is basically writing his own legislation by using the courts. That's exactly what they were doing.
My grandfather knew very precisely what he wanted to see happen with building the public land system. And I think, yes, he did steamroller over local interest in order to get that to happen. And it made a lot of people really angry. And a lot of people still are angry about that.
In addition to the legal system, Pinchot used the press to advance his cause.
They would write articles for magazines, they would write articles for newspapers, they would be interviewed all over the country. They were propagandists for themselves and brilliant at it.
The Western congressmen, they're livid. They can't stand it. They're trying to cut off the budget. You can't, no franking privileges. You cannot spend any money on mail. Stop, stop, stop. But the stuff keeps rolling out.
Westerners also complained about the amount of land that the Roosevelt administration was withdrawing from the public domain.
Congress then passed a law that said that the president no longer could simply delineate land and say this is going to be a national forest, and they put this in a spending bill.
The president had 10 days to sign the bill before it would die by pocket veto.
There was a set of days in which Pinchot and the Forest Service looked at maps, circumscribed areas on land that said that these were going to be new forests.
They just drew lines around areas and made them national forests.
They're called the midnight forests, the term meaning that this was done at midnight, both in the dark of night but also rapidly on the part of the Forest Service.
Teddy Roosevelt would put more land into the public land system than any other president.
In his first term, he was quite cautious. He set aside about 20 million acres of land by presidential proclamation under the Forest Reserve Act of 1891. But in his second term, he really went to town, and he set aside approximately 80 million acres of land, which is almost the equivalent of California.
The states called a convention called the Denver Public Lands Convention in 1907, in which these Western states would hopefully argue that the federal government has no rights over these lands.
For 2 days during the Denver Convention, Westerners attacked the federal land grab and the man they called Tsar Pinchot, whom they held responsible for it. On the 3rd day, Pinchot stood before the convention to speak.
One must appreciate the enormity of the selling that he had to do. He had to go out onto a frontier and convince people that they could indeed still have the resource even if they turned it over to government management and wise use.
When they were finishing howling, swearing and yelling at him, Pinchot then turned and talked to them about why he believed conservation was critical. He didn't say, "You're wrong and I'm right." What he said was, "You should understand why conservation is going to save you."
Gifford Pinchot had become the most ardent and persuasive advocate for Teddy Roosevelt's conservation policy. Yet early in this progressive era, a split developed between those like Pinchot who favored wise use and those who favored stronger protection, like naturalist and Sierra Club founder John Muir.
John Muir argued that these national forests that were being created in the early part of the 20th century actually ought to be preserved. No use whatsoever, no cutting, no mining, no grazing.
Pinchot disagreed with the preservationist approach, arguing that the only way to save the forests was conservation, the careful and controlled use of natural resources.
The national forest could not have been sold to the American people without the guarantee of use. And the Forest Service always promised the American people that wisely managed these lands could be used for hundreds of years to come. If the idea of preservation only had been advocated, we would not have had the national forest because the American people would not have accepted it.
What's interesting about Pinchot and Muir is they've come to stand for two radically different visions. On the one hand, Pinchot presents himself as standing for the democratic good, standing for the use of nature to benefit as many people as possible. Muir, on the other hand, stands for nature as the place to which we go to understand the creation in its whole glorious beauty. And those are both, in their way, very attractive visions, but they were on kind of a collision course.
The two views collided in a scenic valley of Yosemite National Park known as Hetch Hetchy. Yosemite and a handful of other western parks were patrolled by the Army in this era before there was a Park Service.
The Hetch Hetchy controversy is one of the most explosive events in the history of conservation in the United States. It was probably the first time in which a debate over development or preservation erupted onto the national stage. At its center were two men, John Muir, who argued that this gorgeous valley in the Hetch Hetchy section of Yosemite National Park should be preserved. On the other side was Gifford Pinchot. San Francisco desperately needed a new, safe reservoir. So when San Francisco applied for a dam in the Hetch Hetchy Valley, Pinchot was one of those who supported it.
The eventual decision to build the dam would be a crushing blow to John Muir. It would lead some to call for the creation of a new agency to manage the national parks.
I started off as a John Muir preservationist. I thought that Gifford Pinchot was some screwball, with these utilitarian ideas. I had no idea what this was all about. I go back and read the book. The first principle of conservation is development. Well, development was the problem. How could that be the first principle of conservation? And it wasn't until, I actually got experience working in real communities and I found out, that the central problems are economics, and you're never going to solve conservation if you can't address the fundamental well-being of the community, and you can't address the fundamental social justice in the community. If you can't address those two parts of the equation, then you're never going to preserve anything.
He was convinced that forestry would only succeed if the citizenry felt that it was paying a dividend to them. And so he has to figure out a way by which to articulate this. And the key for him then is that wonderful sentence, the greatest good of the greatest number in the longest run.
The idea behind the greatest good for the greatest number for the longest time is that you do things for the greater public good and benefit, and that's what matters. I think what Pinchot was thinking about is the role that what he called the evils of concentrated wealth, or the using the public resources for personal gain. And that to him that was a sin. It was immoral, and it endangered our national democratic way of life.
Pinchot's final battle as chief of the Forest Service would revolve around just such an issue, a small coal mining claim in Alaska that would explode into the biggest political scandal of the era. When William Howard Taft succeeded Theodore Roosevelt, Pinchot realized that there was no longer a conservationist in the White House.
It's a complicated story, but effectively what agents of the Forest Service came to believe is that the Taft administration was releasing public lands to a syndicate out of New York City.
Richard Ballinger was William Howard Taft's Secretary of the Interior. Pinchot and his allies implicated Ballinger in the Alaska scandal and blamed Taft for not firing him.
He's basically accusing his superiors of corruption. And he's basically telling the President of the United States that he's not doing his job, and he's doing it publicly.
Unable to resolve this rift within his administration, Taft fired Gifford Pinchot.
He should have been fired for insubordination because he was insubordinate.
Pinchot was defiant and publicly upbeat about his dismissal. It allowed him to campaign openly for the cause of conservation. But at Forest Service headquarters, where he gave a rallying farewell speech, his employees were apprehensive.
They understood that he had created this entity, and to have him leave under these circumstances was awful because it wasn't clear to them whether in fact the agency would continue once its charismatic creator had disappeared.
Would we have a Forest Service if we didn't have Gifford Pinchot? I think yes. But I think it would be so different we would hardly recognize it.
He was only head of the Forest Service for 5 years. It wasn't really even a full 5 years. But his stamp on this agency was then and remains profound.
He invented something really completely new, and it became known as conservation.
The summer that followed Pinchot's firing provided a test for the young agency as it set out to build a system for delivering the greatest good.
Well, 1910 was truly one of the formative events in American fire history. It was a kind of perfect storm. It all came together. You have an extended drought. There was lots of fuel around. Lots of lightning begins in July. There were lots of human-caused fires, lots of railroad fires. And then finally, on the morning of August 20th, it all exploded in what became known as the Big Blow-Up.
The Forest Service at that time was 5 years old. It had about 400 rangers in the field. They were incapable of mounting a defense, let alone an offense, against something that burned 3 million acres in 2 days and killed 85 people.
High winds fanned isolated fires into a fast-moving wall of flame. Towns were evacuated just before they were incinerated. Trains raced over burning trestles moments before they collapsed. The firefighters just tried to survive.
Ed Pulaski was the icon ranger of 1910. He was everything that an old-time ranger should be. He cared about his men, and he got caught by the 1910 fire.
The winds are plucking up trees, and sparks are coming down. It's absolutely dark. They can hardly see anything. And what you forget about it is not just the visuals, the heat, it's the noise, the enormous roar that occurs, like 1,000 trains rushing over 1,000 steel trestles, one of them remarked later.
He remembered an old mine shaft
and led his men, about 40 of them, with horses, and put them inside the shaft, there to wait while the fire blew past them. And it must have been an absolute nightmare. I mean, there was nothing but darkness and fire and smoke.
It's all panic and pandemonium, and at least one guy in the back shouts he at least is getting out and decides he's going to run out of the cave, and Pulaski holds him in at gunpoint, threatening to shoot whoever would try to leave, knowing that if panic set in, they would all be overcome.
After the fire had passed the next morning, the men staggered out of the mouth of the mine, and there was Ed's body blocking the way. And one of them said, "My God, the boss is dead." And Ed pulled himself up off the floor of the mine and said, "Like hell he is."
5 died in all, the rest survived, and they unanimously attributed their survival to Ed Pulaski and his stand. Pulaski himself is badly hurt, couldn't see, suffered from lung ailments, but they managed to get the rest of the crew back into town, and he becomes the sort of great hero of the 1910 fires.
The big blow-up consumed nearly 3 million acres in western Montana and northern Idaho. But its longest-term effect was on Forest Service policy.
They were conscience-struck by what had happened, and they vowed never to let it happen again.
The fires of 1910 catalyzed the federal policy of full fire suppression. Foresters labeled fire as public enemy #1, overcoming the objections of those who saw benefits from fire. Native Americans and settlers had a long tradition of using fires to clear undergrowth and stimulate grasses. For Pinchot and others trained in Europe, stopping fires was essential to efficient forest management. For the Forest Service, fire suppression was clearly the greatest good.
After 1910, it was almost impossible for anyone within the Forest Service to advocate anything other than all-out war against fire.
Fire would persist, and it would become, perhaps paradoxically, the major index of Forest Service success.
At the beginning of the 20th century, you had a horse and a shovel. That was really the way fires were fought. You couldn't get into the back country to fight a fire for days because you had to go by trail.
The assault on forest fires required a big investment in infrastructure: roads, communications, equipment, and lookout towers. The biggest challenge, however, was finding men for the front lines.
The fire crews in 1910 were stumble-bum crews. You would have a ranger who was a competent individual, but he would go to a saloon or a post office or someplace like that to get his crew together. And there are hilarious accounts from these guys of what it was like trying to herd a bunch of guys with hangovers out onto the fire line. You'd lose 20, 30% while you were getting them out there. You know, they just kind of fall into the bushes.
It was equally hard to find qualified lookouts. In 1913, after a fire spotter in California's Klamath National Forest quit, Assistant Forest Ranger M.H. McCarthy informed his forest supervisor that he had 3 applicants for the position. One was a drunk, the second had poor eyesight, the third was no gentleman. Hallie Morse Daggett became the first female fire lookout. She and others, like Helen Dow in Colorado, were pioneers in an era before women could vote. The national forests had been carved out of the vast public domain lands, which were mainly in the western states. In 1911, a bill sponsored by Representative John Weeks authorized the Forest Service to buy from willing sellers the cheap, deforested lands of the East, South, and Lake states.
In the eastern part of the country, the national forests were created out of the lands that nobody wanted. And these lands were purchased under the Weeks Act to protect the watershed, and they were generally purchased for about $3.43 an acre.
As the Forest Service expanded in the east, it also tried to add the western national parks. Preservationists, furious over the Hetch Hetchy Dam, argued that a separate parks agency in the Interior Department would do a better job of protecting the parks.
The Forest Service was not very pleased with the idea of a competitive agency, to say the least. And suddenly, here's the National Park Service saying that the Grand Canyon National Monument, which at that time was managed by Gifford Pinchot's U.S. Forest Service, should instead now be in 1919 be Grand Canyon National Park, managed by the National Park Service.
And so there was a concern among some foresters, particularly at the upper levels, that the Park Service was after some of their most precious holdings.
The eventual response of the Forest Service as the Park Service begins to win these battles is, why don't we get into recreation in our own right? Why don't we form our own recreational agenda for the National Forest?
The race was on. As Thomas Edison and Henry Ford went on well-publicized camping trips, joined at times by the President of the United States. The Park Service and the Forest Service were opening public lands to a nation falling in love with the automobile. As roads penetrated the national forests, more and more summer homes were built. At Trappers Lake in Colorado, Forest Service landscape architect Arthur Carhart had the assignment of designing a group of cabins with roads leading to them.
Carhart came up with the rather modest but quite important idea that rather than developing this lakefront, it ought to be preserved. That these vacation homes ought to be kept at least a half a mile away from the lakefront. Carhart's suggestion